There are currently 26 Republican and 24 Democratic governors in the United States. 11 of those states head to the polls for gubernatorial races this November. Here to talk about them is Jessica Taylor with Cook Political Report. She's their governor's editor. Jessica Taylor, what are some overarching themes or theme of these governors' races?
The majority of them are in safe states. So really we're seeing in the primaries, if it's a Republican state like Indiana or Missouri, you're really trying to see the candidates burnish their conservative credentials. They're talking about social issues and different things. On the Democratic side, and especially in the two toss-up races that we have, Democrats are really making abortion access and abortion rights a focus, which of course is something that we saw play a major role in the 2022 gubernatorial races after the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So we're still seeing that as a major issue, but really we only rate 3 of these races as competitive, and actually there's no Democratic incumbents that are on the ballot this cycle. All of the Democratic held seats are open, while we will have several new governors across the country because of term limits.
So what does this mean for the parties then, given who's up and from which party?
So, I cover the Senate as well, and I think voters look at governors and senators differently. This is really the one place where you still see that candidates matter, very much so. And it's because you mentioned there's 26 and 24 split, but no party gets a prize because you have the most governors. So that's how you can have, last cycle in the off year in 2023, Andy Beshear, a Democrat in Kentucky, was reelected. How Vermont has a Republican governor that's going to be heavily favored to win another 2-year term. So you can kind of see some oddities in the way that, Kentucky would never send a Democratic senator to Washington, or Vermont's not going to send a Republican. And I think, when we look at even some of the Senate races, when we see former governors try to run for Senate, it becomes a lot harder. Larry Hogan this cycle has a really uphill climb. So governors, they're a little bit on an island of themselves because they are running for a chief executive. But again, they can make this race sort of about the candidate more in a way. And that's why I think candidate quality is going to matter in a lot of these really close races as well.
Are there some similarities in what voters expect from their chief executive when they vote for them?
So it's really interesting because during COVID and after COVID, we really saw, I think, voters pay more attention to their governors because they were setting rules. They were talking about mask mandates or COVID or vaccinations and different things. And so Morning Consult does a good track of the governors, and we really saw, I think, interest go up. And actually, most of these governors overwhelmingly are very popular. Like I said, you don't have to take as divisive sides on an issue. So you're not going to be taking, a national view on, foreign policy necessarily. A lot of these are more domestic issues, trade or the economy and different things. So, when overwhelming, it's very hard to beat a governor as well. So in 2022, only one incumbent governor, Steve Sisolak in Nevada, lost re-election. And I think that was a state that was uniquely hit hard because of its focus on tourism and gaming by the economy post-COVID. So overwhelmingly, these governors are very popular, and all of them that are running for re-election, we have in the solid column. The only ones that are in a more competitive column are ones that are open seats.
Let's talk about your columns before we jump into some of these races. How do you go about your ratings?
I think we look at it both qualitatively and quantitatively. So we look at polls, and we get access to a lot of polls that I think the average viewer doesn't have because we're talking with consultants, we're talking with people on the campaigns, we're talking with, the committees. So there is the Democratic Governors Association and the Republican Governors Association. So they're devoted simply to trying to win these races at the state level. So we talk with them, and then, we meet with candidates, and we meet with governors when they're in town for like the National Governors Association meeting every year. But we're really talking with sources that have worked in the state, know these races, know them locally. So it's, like I said, sometimes local officials, state officials, people on the ground that have really worked the grassroots in these campaigns. So it's a lot of phone calling, source work, and sometimes we'll go to the states or things, So, North Carolina is probably the biggest governor's race this cycle, and my best friend lives in Raleigh, so I'm down there a lot, coincidentally.
That works out well.
Yeah.
Well, let's start with the state of Delaware. The primary is September 3rd. You rate this as solid Democrat. Talk about the race.
Yeah, so you have an open seat there. And, I think it's really going to come down to the Democratic primary there. You have the Lieutenant Governor, Bethany Hall Long, and then
Executive Matt Meyer.
Matt Meyer,
Yeah.
sorry, yes. And I think that primary is going to be primarily between the two of them. Like I said, it's very late. Republicans, there are Republicans running, but I don't expect this to be, races like this are decided in the primary, basically. The county executive there is a very big role. It covers a lot of people and different things. So, while you would look and say that the lieutenant governor probably would normally in many states have an advantage, you see that as a stepping stone. I think this is going to be a really competitive primary. And just that we're so early, it's several months. I feel like voters there haven't really tuned in, so we haven't really seen a lot of polling, but this isn't our solid Democrat column.
Solid Democrat because of the number of Democrats in the state?
Yes. I mean, this is a state, Joe Biden's home state. It's going to go blue at the presidential level. Again, Republicans are not contesting this one, so I think it's going to stay, again, another open seat, but it's going to stay in solid Democrat.
Moving on to Washington State, likely Democrat here.
Yes. So this is an interesting one. You have Governor Jay Inslee, who is retiring. Now, unlike some other states, Washington actually doesn't have term limits. So Inslee could have run for a fourth term, which would have been very unprecedented. So you have, and Washington also has an all-party primary system. So all of the candidates are going to be on the August ballot, and the top two candidates, regardless of party, will advance. The Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, is the clear Democratic frontrunner. There is a more moderate candidate running, but I think he has the most money. He has the institutional support. I think we expect him to place first, actually, in that primary. And, when this race came open, I even wrote that, Republicans had an opportunity if they nominated the right type of candidate. Well, they got a really interesting candidate in this race, former Congressman Dave Reichert. He retired several years ago, but he's also really well known there. He was actually the sheriff there that caught the Green River Killer in Washington State. So he has this law enforcement background. In fact, I was, watching Forensic Files the other day, and it comes on about him. So he was well known, wrote a book about this race, this case before he was elected and things too. So he has more of a moderate profile and has those type of crossover votes. But he also was defeated for the Republican endorsement at the convention, which is not uncommon that we're seeing as we go through some of the other states. In Utah, the incumbent governor, Governor Cox, lost the endorsement. So that doesn't necessarily reflect what is going on at what I think will be reflected in some of these primaries. So I expect that to be between, again, Ferguson and Reichert there. Kind of an interesting quirk that happened. You had some conservative activists that tried to get some other candidates on the ballot, also named Bob Ferguson. So there were two other Bob Fergusons that were going to be on the ballot, but then there was a state law, the way it was written, if you were just trying to do this to detract votes, it was illegal. So they have been kicked off or withdrawn from the ballot. So there will not be a trio of Bob Fergusons.
Right, a battle of the Bobs there
Yes.
for a while. But you had initially rated this solid Democrat, and because Reichert got into this race, now you're saying likely Democrat.
It's likely Democrat now, but we've seen some really close polls. So I would watch our ratings in the coming weeks. I think this is a race that we're, again, looking at the data, especially what happened in the convention. Does Reichert's support falter among more conservatives? Because, Republicans in states like this, they still have to have the conservative base behind them in many ways and get swing voters and stuff too. So that's sort of Reichert's path there. And because Inslee had been in office so long too, I think we sort of saw this in Oregon last cycle with Kate Brown that was leaving. His approval ratings are much higher than hers were, but there is a little bit of a hangover after you've had the same party in office there for a while. So Republicans do feel like this is a really unique opportunity. And even Democrats admit, Reichert is probably the best candidate they could have gotten in this instance.
In Washington State, what are the demographics like with the population and the parties?
Yeah,
there?
it's still overwhelmingly Democratic, and the registration is, but again, the way the primary is can allow a more moderate candidate like Reichert to get there, because I think if he were running in simply a Republican primary, that could be more difficult and things. So it is overwhelmingly Democratic. It's going to go Democratic at the presidential level. But again, as I said, these are places where we can still see them splitting votes in many ways. That I think there certainly will be some Biden-Reichert voters. Will there be enough? That's the question.
North Carolina, you mentioned this earlier as an interesting race to watch.
I think this is the marquee race of the cycle to watch. So it's really interesting because despite North Carolina moving toward Republicans at the federal level, they now hold both Senate seats. Former President Trump has carried the state twice. Obama lost it in 2012 after carrying it in 2008. But at the gubernatorial level, in the past 100 years, they've only had 3 Republican governors. So the outgoing governor, who's term limited, Roy Cooper, has been incredibly popular, and he has won in 2016 and in 2020, even as Trump carried the state. So you see that ticket splitting there. And Democrats also have, much like Ferguson in Washington, they have this interesting sort of attorney general to governor pipeline. We saw it in 2022 with Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, some other places where that's happened too. So they like these candidates that have, again, law enforcement backgrounds. You have, so Josh Stein is the attorney general there. He's been seen as the natural successor to Roy Cooper there for a long time. And then you have the Republican nominee as the lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. He's a very interesting candidate. He sort of came up out of nowhere to win in 2020 over more seasoned politicians. He made a stirring speech over conservative rights and gun rights at some local party meetings, local school board meetings, and sort of rose up through the grassroots. He's African American. He speaks to a lot of churches. He has sort of the cadence of a pastor. But he also has a history of saying a lot of controversial things. And there's a lot of video that Democrats are already using against him. And I think early on in this race, that's why I had a rated lean Democrat, because we saw in 2022 that like I said, in governor's races, candidates matter more. So you saw Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, a weak candidate, lose. You saw Carrie Lake in Arizona lose. She's running for Senate again, of course. But I just think that in governor's races, candidates matter. But I do think we see where President Biden's numbers are in the state. Trump is leading this here comfortably. And I think it's going to, Robinson also is running a strong campaign. He's raising money. National Republicans are behind him, but he has a long history of saying things about abortion. Like I said, that's going to be another key issue there. And he has a history of saying anti-Semitic remarks and things about LGBTQ people. I mean, North Carolina has become more competitive in recent years because you have a lot of college graduates, particularly women, moving into the research triangle around Raleigh and Durham and Charlotte and things too. So is this something that's going to turn off the voters? I think if you had a more mainstream Republican winning, I think Republicans would have maybe even be the favorites in this race. But I think Robinson is still a very volatile candidate, that they have a lot to use against him. But I just look at where the president's numbers are, and that's why we recently moved this into the toss-up column.
Where are the president's numbers? Because we did see him visit the state of North Carolina, touting his record.
Yeah. His approval ratings are usually somewhere in the, I think, high 30s or low 40s. This is a state that the Biden campaign would like to make more competitive. When I look at the electoral map, I don't see that as a reality. That he's struggling already in places like in other sort of Sunbelt states like Georgia and Arizona and Nevada. So, I think he's going to have to focus on, those Rust Belt states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and things to get to 270. So I still think North Carolina, I think they might ultimately look at that this is a bit of a reach. And that might help Josh Stein, actually, if he's able to separate himself from the president in a way that Roy Cooper was sort of able to separate himself from especially Hillary Clinton in 2016 to defeat an incumbent Republican governor.
So it is possible.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I think, like I said, I think North Carolina does have this tradition, and I think that's what Stein has working in his favor, and that he has a lot of things and video clips to use against Robinson. But I think this is just going to be a very close state, and it's one that we have seen. Republicans have good infrastructure in the state as well.
Another toss-up, New Hampshire.
Yes. This is a state, so both New Hampshire and Vermont are the only states in the country that elect their governors for 2-year terms. So they have to run every 2 years instead of every 4 years. Chris Sununu, whose father was a governor, has been very popular there. He's sort of been able to win re-election even as Democrats have routinely carried the state. He's won re-election handily. In 2022, we had this race rated solid Republican. And honestly, if Sununu had run again, it would have been as well. But he is not running, so this opens the seat up. On the Republican side, you have two major candidates. The frontrunner at this point is former Senator Kelly Ayotte. She lost in 2016 re-election, so she is back running after sort of a hiatus out of politics and different things. And then you have the former state Senate President Chuck Morse, who ran for Senate last cycle as well, and lost that primary, but he's also running. I think you see a lot of the establishment support behind Ayotte. She's sort of running with this message of don't make New Hampshire Massachusetts. That you see a lot of crossover there between the Boston market and the New Hampshire market and things, and people going back and forth. And so she's saying, look what the Democratic Governor Maura Healey there is doing. You don't want this sort of rise in liberal policies or crime and different things to come to New Hampshire. And on the Democratic side, I think that probably Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig has an edge right now, but State Executive Councilor Cindy Warmington is also running. Again, this is also another late primary in September. If either of those races turn really negative, it could hurt those parties because there's not a lot of time to turn around to the general election. But I think this is also a pure toss-up at this point. New Hampshire, also a very state, their motto is live free or die. And, abortion rights has also been a very central focus in this race. And I think you're already seeing Democrats hit Ayotte for her past support of pro-life positions. And then, of course, she actually helped shepherd, she was the Sherpa, as they call it, of Neil Gorsuch, of his Supreme Court nomination shortly after President Trump was elected. And, of course, Gorsuch was a key member of the Supreme Court that led to the Dobbs decision.
Let's move on to some solid Republican races, and there are quite a few, starting with Indiana.
Indiana, so I think this one is pretty well decided with current Senator Mike Braun won this. He won it a very crowded primary, actually, with a lot of people spending money, a lot of different candidates spending money, but he was the front runner sort of from the get-go. I think he had the most name ID, certainly in the state, even though other candidates were sort of outspending him. Another race where I think that this was decided in the primary. Democrats do have a former Republican, a former Secretary of Education, Jennifer McCormick running, but I think in Indiana in a presidential year, that's just going to be very tough. So Braun is the clear favorite in this race.
And in West Virginia?
West Virginia so you have the term-limited Governor Jim Justice running for Senate, and we just finished the primary in May as well there, another very spirited primary. I said it was a little bit like a family reunion because you had, so the current Attorney General, Patrick Morrisey, ended up winning this primary. He had a lot of support from the Club for Growth that really backed him and went after his two opponents. And his two chief opponents were the sons of a current senator and current congresswoman. So you had Chris Miller, that was the son of Congresswoman Carol Miller from West Virginia, and then you had Moore Capito, who is the son of Senator Shelley Moore Capito, and of course his grandfather was governor there as well. The Capito family is incredibly well known and established there in West Virginia. So he beat two really important. Like I said, he was able to divide the vote. He did not get a majority, but I think that you had a lot of people dividing their vote regionally. He runs really strong. Morrissey ran really strong in more rural areas and in the Panhandle, whereas Huntington was sort of the Miller area, and then and you saw Capito running strong in other areas.
Let's talk about on the Democratic side, who's running here?
Yeah, so the nominee is Huntington Mayor Steve Williams. However, I will add a caveat. This race might get a little more interesting. I doubt that it will, because, again, the retiring Senator Joe Manchin, who was the former governor, very popular there. I think he was going to lose in a race to Jim Justice. He elected not to run again. There are some rumors going around that he's being urged to step in and maybe take Williams's place. Now, Williams has denied this. He says he's running. But certainly if you had Manchin come back, that would make what is a slam dunk a little more interesting. Morrissey actually ran against Manchin and lost in the 2018 Senate race. He's a pretty he's a little bit of a polarizing figure within the Republican community, especially I think among more business aligned Republicans in the state. So it seems like Manchin might be getting encouragement from some of those more moderate Republicans to reconsider, but I feel like there's always a rumor that Joe Manchin's going to do something. He's going to run for no labels. He's going to run as an independent for the Senate, or, you know, all of these different things. So I think Joe Manchin makes a lot of headlines, and we'll see what he ends up deciding.
Yeah, that's one to watch. We'll put a pin in that. Let's move on to Missouri. The primary is August 6th. The current governor, Mike Parson, Republican, is term limited. On the Republican side, you have the leading candidate, Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, and Lieutenant Governor Mike Kehoe.
This is another August primary, so I think that Ashcroft has most of the institutional support, and he certainly has the name recognition. Now, this is the son of former Attorney General John Ashcroft, who was also Senator and Governor of Missouri. So the Ashcroft family there. We see this a lot in families, actually. You know, I was talking about sort of West Virginia there, but again, you know, this current governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, his father was governor. So you kind of see, and as I mentioned, Chris Sununu, his father also was. So you get these kind of political dynasties in the state in a way, and so the Ashcroft one is there. So you have the Lieutenant Governor Mike Kehoe. He's raising a lot of money, and so I don't think this race is completely over, but Ashcroft absolutely benefits from the name ID in this race.
This is solid Republican as well. The leading Democratic candidate, Crystal Quaid. Does she have a chance?
There could be an abortion ballot measure on the ballot, and I think that is something that they hope will excite Democratic voters, and so you could see abortion be an issue here. But again, in a presidential year, I find it really hard.
North Dakota, primary is June 11th. So
yes.
Current Governor Doug Burgum, retiring, considered a potential vice president pick, as our audience will know, for former President Donald Trump. So who's running here? I mean, solidly Republican. What do you think happens in this state?
Yeah, so the at-large Congressman Kelly Armstrong, I think, is the leading candidate here. You have the Lieutenant Governor, who is also running, spending a lot of her own money. But I think sources we've talked to certainly see, I think, Armstrong is the one to lose. He's very popular. But, you know, Burgum got to the governor's race because he spent a lot of his own money. You know, that's something that's appealing to him for Trump, that he could bring a lot of money to that race. So we will see there, but I think Armstrong is probably the favorite, but again, a little ways to go until the primary.
And then there's the lieutenant governor that's running as well on the Republican side, Tammy Murphy. She was appointed by Burgum in 2023.
Yes.
Her chances?
I guess she's spending a lot of her own money. So in a small state like North Dakota, ad buys are not very expensive. So again, like the way she's spending money could certainly boost her chances. But this is one that will be decided, I think, between, as you mentioned, Murphy and Armstrong there in the primary.
Our last solid Republican, Montana.
Yes. So Greg Gianforte, the current governor, is running for re-election there. He's expected he is the clear favorite there as well. I mean, this is a key state in the Senate race with John Tester running there. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of Tester Gianforte voters. Is it going to be enough to save Tester? We'll see. I think that's a state, again, that Trump won by 16. It's going to be very difficult. Ryan Bussey is the leading candidate here. He's a gun control advocate. He's sort of arguing for responsible gun ownership. You can't really be anti-gun in a place like Montana. It's really interesting. But I think this is a very uphill climb for anyone. Gianforte has... there's been increase in property taxes in Montana. Bussey's campaign is really hitting him over some of that, and his approval ratings have gone down a little bit. Gianforte, also another millionaire that spent to win this race the first time, so he can also put his own money into the race.
You mentioned these two states earlier, but they have popular, moderate GOP incumbents. Utah, Governor Spencer Cox, and in Vermont, Governor Phil Scott.
Yes.
So are these likely going to stay Republican?
I think they absolutely are. So Cox is really interesting. He's chairman of the National Governors Association. I wouldn't even really call him a moderate. He's a conservative, but he's a pragmatist. So he's talked a lot about working across the aisle, bipartisan. Actually, when he ran in 2020, he cut an ad with his Democratic opponent saying, you know, don't hate us, we get along, you know? So he's really talked a lot about civility in politics and what's missing from that. And, it was a little bit in the style of Mitt Romney, the, retiring senator there. But Cox lost the nomination at the primary there to really a gadfly candidate, Bryant. And Cox has the clear advantage here because we see this happening, that the conventions in many states are more conservative than the electorate is going to be. And especially in Utah, a heavily Mormon state, of course, they've shown a little bit more of a resistance to the Trump-style politics. This is where you had the third-party candidate, Evan McMullin, get a lot of the vote in 2016. And it gave Trump one of his lowest percentages, certainly much lower than, favorite son Romney got and even McCain and Bush got. So, again, at the convention, you see the most conservative of the conservatives. And Cox, I think, is going to clearly win here as well.
Moving to Vermont, how does the home state of Senator Bernie Sanders have a Republican governor?
Because Phil Scott has really cultivated, as he's an anti-Trump Republican. He, again, this is how I think, you see some of these governors. I mean, Vermont is the most sort of puzzling when you look at that. Again, Kansas has a Democratic senator. That people vote for the person. Now, this one might have gotten a little interesting. It seemed like it might for a little bit because you had former Governor Howard Dean that was briefly talking about running. So that would have been really interesting. And even though, Dean was elected before and had served the state before he ran for president, I still don't think he could have beat Phil Bryant. So I think that he's going, we have it rated solid Republican, and I don't see that changing.
Jessica Taylor, Cook Political Reports, Governor's Editor. We always appreciate all of the details and the insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
A few more notes from this week's campaign trail. The New Jersey Globe reported Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, who faces federal corruption charges along with his wife, has filed enough signatures to run as an independent in this year's U.S. Senate race in New Jersey. His independent run comes as Congressman Andy Kim won New Jersey's Democratic U.S. Senate primary on Tuesday. It's unclear how Senator Menendez's filing will impact the race overall. We'll keep an eye out for any polling in this race. Two highlights from the presidential race over the past week. First, President Biden announcing executive action on the U.S.-Mexico border, changing the rules for asylum seekers that the president said would help curb migration to the U.S. And after that, former President Trump from Phoenix, where he panned President Biden's executive actions as ineffective.
Come here today to do what the Republicans in Congress refuse to do. Take the necessary steps to secure our border. Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum. Migrants will be restricted from receiving asylum at our southern border unless they seek it after entering through an established lawful process. And those who seek to come to the United States legally, for example, by making an appointment and coming to a port of entry, asylum will still be available to them, still available. But if an individual chooses not to use our legal pathways, if they choose to come without permission and against the law, they'll be restricted from receiving asylum and staying in the United States. This action will help us to gain control of our border, restore order into the process. This ban will remain in place until the number of people trying to enter illegally is reduced to a level that our system can effectively manage. In addition to this action, we recently made important reforms in our asylum system, more efficient and more secure reforms. The goal is to deliver decisions on asylum as quickly as possible. As far as I'm concerned, if you're not willing to spend the money to hire more Border Patrol agents, more asylum officers, more judges, more high-tech machinery, you're just not serious about protecting our border. It's as simple as that. I believe that immigration has always been the lifeblood of America. We're constantly renewed by an infusion of people and new talent. So I will never demonize immigrants. I'll never refer to immigrants as poisoning the blood of a country. And further, I'll never separate children from their families at the border. I will not ban people from this country because of their religious beliefs. I will not use the U.S. military to go into neighborhoods all across the country to pull millions of people out of their homes and away from their families to put detention camps while awaiting deportation, as my predecessor says he will do if he occupies his office again.
This election coming up on November 5th, 2024, is going to go down as the most important day because If we don't win, it's we, it's all of us, it's millions of people. If we don't win, this country is finished. I really believe that. I think it's finished. In addition, Crooked Joe's action dramatically expands the Biden migrant smartphone app. Do you believe this? He's talking about a smartphone. He has no idea what a smartphone is. Biden's order is not a border security plan. It's a concession to the fact that he has lost control over our border. He's totally lost control over the border, and it's a really dangerous place. He is conceding death, and he's conceding defeat at the border. On day one of my administration, I will be rescinding Crooked Joe's outrageous executive order. And I will be slamming the door shut on the Biden migrant app, and I will terminate every single open borders policy of the Biden administration as soon as I take the oath of office. It will take place on the exact same day. The result of Biden's action this week will be more innocent Americans killed by illegal alien criminals, more children trafficked and sold into slavery, and millions more illegal aliens pouring into our country, and many will come through a very beautiful place known as Arizona. If Joe Biden truly wanted to sign an executive order to stop the invasion, he only needs a single sentence, and it would say, I hereby immediately reinstate every single border policy of a gentleman named Donald J. Trump, who was president of the United States.
A reminder, this program and all of C-SPAN's campaign 2024 coverage can be found online at cspan.org/campaign.